Alright, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. I'll try to turn you on to great theories and discoveries and concepts that you haven't heard of because they've been suppressed. Things that the powers that be don't want you to know. But if you did know, they would empower you in various ways. Today is another Bible Decode, number 301, and we've been looking into something that they don't really want you to know about the Bible, which is its history, how it got to be the way it is, when it was written, how it was written, who it was written by, why was it written, and how did it get to be, how did the various books of the Bible get to be in the Bible, and how did certain other works not get to be in the Bible. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, well, they're in the Bible, but there are many, many, many other Gospels that are not in the Bible. And your pastor or reverend does not want you to read those. And in fact, sometimes will get pretty animated telling you not to read those. And the question is why? You would think that if you were a Christian and you worship Jesus, that you would want to know as much as possible about him as possible. Good or bad, or true or false. Some of these other Gospels, maybe they're not the complete truth. Maybe they're not the inspired Word of God, but they probably would tell you something. Probably would give you some insight that you don't have. But alas, most Christians are not curious enough to dig into these, or maybe are too afraid to dig into these. And so we're reading a book here from Bronson Keeler that is called History of the Bible. And this book came out in 1881 and reflects some of the scientific materialism of the age, but also gets into many interesting aspects of the Bible, including this chapter, which is on the formation of the canon, of the Christian canon. Now, we already went through a little bit on the Old Testament, formation of the Old Testament, and the function of the church fathers from maybe the 2nd to the 5th centuries, and their role in creating the canon and really understanding the Gospels. And this author really claims that it was a good 150 years after the purported death of Jesus before any of these Gospels were really known. We are in this chapter 8, and we're talking about Origen, Origen, one of the church fathers who lived in the early half of the 3rd century. And the author, quoting the author here from now, Origen did not formulate a consecutive list of the New Testament books, but passages gathered here and there from his works indicate what his opinion was. He apparently divided the books into 3 classes: authentic, unauthentic, and uncertain. The first included the 4 Gospels, Acts, 14 epistles of Paul, 1 Peter, 1 John, and the Revelation of John. The second included the Shepherd of Hermas, which is an apocryphal or spurious work these days, though he was rather inclined to place it in a higher class, and also the Epistle of Barnabas, another apocryphal work. the Acts of Paul, another, the Gospel according to the Hebrews, another, the Gospel of the Egyptians, and the preaching of Peter. This is his unauthentic list. And then his uncertain list included the epistles of James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2 John, and 3 John, all of which are in the Bible today. So it sounds like Origen's, his list is pretty similar to the Bible today. All the books that he says are, certain are in the Bible, and the ones that are unauthentic tend to be apocryphal, and then the ones that are uncertain are also in the Bible. Eusebius, the ecclesiastical historian who flourished in the early 4th century, divided the books into 3 classes: the acknowledged, the disputed, and the heretical. The acknowledged books included the 4 Gospels, the Acts, 13 epistles of Paul, omitting Hebrews, 1 John, and 1 Peter. They were the books concerning which there was no controversy. The disputed books he divided into 2 subordinate classes: the generally known and recognized by most, namely James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2 John, and 3 John, none of which are disputed now, so far as the laity ever hears, and the spurious, including the Acts of Paul, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Revelation of Peter, the Epistle of Barnabas, the teaching of the apostles, and the Revelation of John, which last is in the Bible today, and the Gospel according to the Hebrews. So all the rest of them are not, except for that Revelation. The heretical books included the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Matthew, which is not the one now in the Bible. So apparently there were 2 Gospels of Matthew. The Acts of the Apostles by Andrew, and the Acts of the Apostles by John. The Epistle of that's the end of the sentence. The Epistle of James, which is now in the Bible and which he here classes as generally recognized, in another place he calls spurious. And of Revelation he says that possibly it should be among the acknowledged books, but that some rejected it. The idea as to what composed the Bible was in the minds of the fathers vague and indefinite. Such a strict and unalterable rule as we have now they did not possess. Eusebius was a bishop of the Eastern Church, and the reader will observe as we progress that the Church uniformly discarded revelation. Cyril, the Bishop of Jerusalem in the mid-4th century, a member of the Eastern Church, made a catalog which included in the Old Testament Baruch and the Epistle of Jeremiah, the Song of the 3 Children, History of Susanna, and Belt and the Dragon, none of which are now in our Bible. His New Testament included the books now in it except Revelation, and he adds, but let all the rest be excluded, and all the books which are not read in the churches, neither do thou read thyself. So there's some censorship going on. There's some stuff that they don't want you to read. They're protecting you from reading this false doctrine, according to their thinking. The famous Gothic version of the Bible made by Ulfilas, a Gothic bishop in the mid-4th century, omitted the 2 books of Samuel and the books of Kings because they contained accounts of wars likely to inflame the spirit of the Goths. only a small reason was needed in those days to keep a book out of the Bible. More than 350 years passed away, and it became apparent that the fathers could not agree as to what books should be in the Bible, and the councils began to deal with the matter. The first Christian assembly at which the canon was made the subject of a special ordinance was held at Laodicea in 365 AD. Tertullian indeed mentions the fact that synods had acted upon the canonicity of books in his time, which was the early 3rd century, but their authority must have been local and not general. Jerome, who's later, 5th century, also says that the Council of Nicaea included Judith in a list which it adopted. But I can find no good evidence that the Council of Nicaea acted on the canon at all, although there is a very general impression that it did. Westcott thinks that it is only some casual reference which Jerome here alludes to. The current tradition is that the books were placed under a table at Nicaea, and that after prayer, the canonical ones leaped out from under and the others remained behind. It is said that this story is told by Pappus, a Lutheran divine of the second half of the 16th century. In his Epitome Historiae Ecclesiasticae, De Conversionibus Gentium. It is, of course, fabulous, and probably originated from the fact that at the Council of Chalcedon, the Gospel were placed in the midst of the assembly. The Synod of Laodicea was not a general council of the church, but its list was afterwards adopted by the church, so that virtually that was the first general action on the contents of the Bible. It was a gathering of 24 to 32 of the clergy of Lydia and Phrygia. Whatever the number, the so-called heretics had a majority of the votes present. Its decree was as follows. Psalms composed by private men must not be read in the church, nor uncanonical books, but only the canonical books of the New and Old Testament. How many books must be read? Then follows the list as we have it today, except that the Old Testament has Baruch and the Epistle of Jeremiah, neither of which are now in the Bible. And the New Testament omits Revelation. Observe for the first time the tone of authority as to what must and must not be read. Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, mid-4th century, was at enmity with Eusebius and the clergy of Laodicea. And when the latter declared that Revelation was not in the Bible, Athanasius immediately promulgated a list in which he declared that it was. In his canon, he says, the books in which alone were proclaimed the doctrine of godliness, and which no man must take from and no man add to. Yet he omitted Esther, which the church has since added, and he also inserted Baruch and the letter of Jeremiah, which the church has since taken away. He expressly declared that Esther was not a part of the Bible and placed it on a level with the Pastor of Hermas and a book called The Doctrine of the Apostles. He closed by saying, quote, let there be no mention of apocryphal writings. He had become tired of the controversy. Amphilochius, bishop of Iconium, mid-4th century, also of the Eastern Church, omitted from the Old Testament Esther, but said that some thought it should be included. Just as an aside, just keep in mind, like with the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in the 1940s and 50s, there were copies of every single book of the Old Testament except for Esther. So Esther seems to be kind of on the cutting floor, or hard to say whether it's going to make the cut or not. In his New Testament, this is Amphilochius. In his New Testament, he gives the 4 Gospels, Acts, and 14 epistles of Paul, and adds, but some maintain that the epistle to the Hebrews is spurious, not speaking well, for the grace it shows is genuine. To proceed, what remains? Of the Catholic epistles, some maintain that we ought to receive 7, and others 3 only, one of James, and one of Peter, and one of John. The revelation of John, again, some reckon among the scriptures, but still the majority say that it is spurious. This will be the most truthful canon of the inspired scriptures, he says. The reader cannot decide from that what he considered, quote, the most truthful canon. But it shows again how entirely unsettled was the question as to what was the Bible and what was not, and that the question was purely a matter of individual opinion. His closing words show that in his time, no list was universally accepted. Gregory of Nazianzus, around the late 4th century, gave as the New Testament the 4 Gospels, the Acts, 14 epistles of Paul, and the 7 Catholic epistles. And he adds, in these you have all the inspired books. If there be any book besides these, it is not among the genuine scriptures. He belonged to the Eastern Church and was thrusting at revelation. I certainly was not aware that Revelation was so borderline. Because these days, it seems like it's one of the most accepted books. But it seems like the church fathers were not happy with that. Now, if you understand the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament, proffered by Joseph Atwill and Michael Menescotts and Abelard Reuchlin, Roman Piso, Henry Davis, James Valiant, and others, they believed that the Romans were actually the true authors of the New Testament, and that it was really the Roman Caesars, but particularly this Piso family. Gaius Piso started it in the 60s AD, and he was actually executed by Nero for proposing for trying to assassinate Nero after Nero rejected his idea, because the Romans were trying to come up with creating a universal religion, and Nero's wife Poppaea was very sympathetic to the Jews. That's one of the main reasons that they were trying to come up with this universal religion, was to incorporate all of the pagan religions, but also to stamp out Judaism, because the Jews were a big pain in the side of the Romans. The Romans had colonized Judea in 63 BC, and for the next 100 years or more, the Jews were constantly engaging in revolts and insurrections, and even wars, culminating in this War of the Jews 66 to 73 AD, which was right after this period. And Gaius Piso, along with Seneca the Younger, and possibly Pliny the Elder, kind of proposed the idea to Nero to come up with this Jewish Messiah who was not a military commander, but who was a Prince of Peace. And Nero rejected the idea, mostly under the influence of Poppaea, and so they tried to assassinate Nero, and Nero found out about it, and he executed Gaius Piso, and his son Arius Piso took up the mantle, and he wrote most of the New Testament or most of the Gospels, and then his family members wrote most of the rest of the New Testament. His son Julius was supposed to be the author of the book of Revelation, but Julius was a person who wasn't in on the PSYOP. He wasn't really down with the deception that the rest of his family was, and so in the book of Revelation he included a lot of stuff that implicated the Romans, in particular Arius Piso, in the fraud. And so that also points here at the very tenuous position of the book of Revelation. Now, according to that theory also, these church fathers, all the way from St. Ignatius to Irenaeus to Origen to Tertullian and Eusebius, these all were also a fraud. They were also Romans, the Roman Caesars. All of the popes, all of the first 30 popes were descended directly from Arius Piso, and so they were all in on it. It was a family tradition, to write fraudulent Christian works, and so the fact that Revelation is so much in a tug of war here is somewhat telling as to whether Julius Piso, who was kind of a heretic to the family or a turncoat to the family, whether his book should be allowed or not. So, because he's exposing the fraud, he calls his father is referred to as the beast. Anyway, by the 7 Catholic epistles is meant always James, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and Jude. Why they are called the Catholic epistle, no one knows. Any explanation of the name is an assumption. So the Bible is basically the 4 Gospels, Acts, the 14 epistles of Paul, and the 7 Catholic epistles, and Revelation. So he's including all of them but Revelation. Epiphanius, in the early 5th century, included the epistle of Jeremiah and Baruch in his Old Testament. St. Chrysostom did not use 2 John, 3 John, 2 Peter, Jude, and Revelation, all of which are in the Bible now, and in a synopsis of Scripture attributed to him, the canonical list of the Old Testament omits 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Esther, Job, and Lamentations. We never hear that St. Chrysostom was liable to eternal damnation because he did not accept the Bible as a whole or believe that every word in the blessed book was inspired by God. Another peculiarity of the list is that it repeats Ruth, showing how careless the fathers could be in stating what was in the sacred volume, and it inserts the wisdom of Jesus, a book which is not now in the Bible. Now, one of the reasons why the Romans took over writing as the church fathers was because their psychological operation to create this religion was largely a failure. And Christianity in the early 2nd century was a flop. The people didn't really believe it. And so they started writing as the church fathers more or less to stir up controversy. So somebody like Marcion wrote this gospel, the Gospel of Marcion, which was a kind of a Gnostic gospel, kind of like John, the Gospel of John. But then there were other church fathers who wrote like against Marcion. I think Irenaeus wrote something against Marcion, and so they were hoping it would stir up controversy and just get people talking about the Bible and Christianity in general, and also to make it look like there were people like passionate on both sides, to make it look like the church was flourishing to some extent, even though it wasn't, and that it really was resurrected from the ashes by Constantine way in the early 4th century, and that the Christian church didn't even really exist in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. It was very fledgling. So take that for what you will. There's a lot of evidence for it, but I've gone into that in previous videos that you can watch. And I'm sure I'll get into it more as we go on. Theodore of Moswestia rejected the book of Job, the epistle of James, 2 Peter, 2 John, 3 John, Jude, and Revelation, all of which are now in the Bible. Theodoret, Bishop of Cyprus, rejected 2 John, 3 John, 2 Peter, Jude, and Revelation. There are 3 great manuscripts of the Greek Bible extant: the Sinaitic, the Vatican, and the Alexandrine. Now keep in mind that the original Gospels were written in Greek, which should be a red flag to you if you're thinking that those are legitimate, because Greek was a rarity among Aramaic speakers in Judea, and only the very elite would have been speaking and or writing in Greek. But in Rome, not so much. These 3 great manuscripts of the Greek Bible are the high courts of appeal in all cases of disputed texts, and their lists are therefore very important. The Sinaitic manuscript is one found by Tischendorf in a convent of St. Catherine, Mount Sinai in 1859, and is probably the oldest of the New Testament codices in existence, dating back to the 4th century. It has the 4 Gospels, the 14 epistles of Paul, Acts, the 7 Catholic epistles, Revelation, but then also it includes the epistle of Barnabas and a part of the Shepherd of Hermas, the last 2 of which are not in the Bible now. The Vatican manuscript in the Vatican Library at Rome belongs to the middle of the 4th century. It ends by mutilation at Hebrews 9:14. Up to that point, it agrees substantially with the Alexandrine manuscript. What other books it may have contained, one cannot say. The Alexandrine manuscript, belonging to the 5th century and written probably in Egypt, includes in the Old Testament Tobit, Judith, Esdras, 1st Maccabees, 2nd Maccabees, 3rd Maccabees, 4th Maccabees, the Wisdom of Solomon, and the Wisdom of Jesus. And in the New Testament, the 2 epistles of Clement, none of which are now in our Bible. The Clermont Codex, a Latin manuscript, now in the Imperial Library at Paris and dating from the 5th to the 8th century, contains a list of the books read in the African church in the 3rd century. Now, the African church was, I think, mainly Alexandria. In its Old Testament list omits First Chronicles, Second Chronicles, and Lamentations, which are now in the Bible, and inserts the wisdom of Solomon, the wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach, Tobit, Judith, First and Second Maccabees, Third Maccabees, which are not in the Bible. And its New Testament list omits Philippians, First Thessalonians, and Second Thessalonians, which are now in the Bible, and inserts the Shepherd of Hermas, the Acts of Paul, and the Revelation of Peter, which are not now in it. The epistle which is now called to the Hebrews is there, called the Epistle to Barnabas. Hilary of Poitiers, in the late 4th century, mid to late 4th century, included the Epistle of Jeremiah in the Old Testament, although it is not now in the Bible. Optatus of Mela, same time period, omitted Hebrews. So, in the early days, books were read in the churches which were known at the time to be spurious and which were not in the canon, and finally they obtained a place in the Bible. This was the case with 2 Peter. Didymus of Alexandria in the late 4th century says that in his time that book was accounted spurious and was not in the canon, and that yet it was publicly read. Today it is not only read in the churches, but is accounted genuine and is in the Bible. And if any modern Orthodox minister, believing, as the ancients did, that it was spurious, decided to say so, or desired to say so, he would not dare do it, since it would unsettle the faith of his congregation. For this he would be dismissed, and the bread and butter of his wife and children would stop. It is thus that ecclesiasticism compels men to play the hypocrite and teach as true what they believe to be false. Okay, that's interesting. And that's, maybe how it should be, that the congregation should be kind of able to boo the preacher off the stage if he's getting into stuff that, or if he's not getting into stuff that they want, but that's not really how it is anymore. The preacher or the priest or the bishop or whatever is kind of the authority, and I haven't been to church many times in my life, but I've never heard of a church service where there has been kind of a rebellion, or where the preacher gets booed or dismissed, or gets even any grumbling from the parishioners. So maybe that should have, and that is actually how like Shakespeare and even orchestras used to be in the